to be carted off to the camps. The people in the Warsaw Ghetto, I don't think they fought to survive because they thought, yeah, we're going to win, we're going to beat the German army. I think they fought to survive because they couldn't do anything else. It was an absolute last-ditch desperate situation. And we're in a last-ditch desperate situation in which what we're doing is rebelling. Yeah, absolutely. But we need to be ready to experience the great sorrow and not resist it. We need to be ready to accept that the likelihood that we're going to win, at least win outright, is minuscule. Like I say, in my experience, climate grief keeps on coming. It comes in waves. Unless there is a miracle, then societies like ours are going to decline, basically, in the course of our lifetimes. They're going to face a growing series of interlocking crises. We're probably already experiencing one of them this year. And it's not going to be the case that the climate and ecological emergency gets solved. It's certainly not going to be prevented. It's going to be a matter of mitigating it, in the true sense of that word, mitigation, and it's going to be a matter of adapting to the changed and declining circumstances in which we find ourselves. And that's a horrible thing to have to accept, but if we don't accept it as a very likely reality, then I think we're in a kind of soft denial of reality. We're not facing up to climate reality. And that's where the concept which I want to talk with you in the remainder of this talk comes in, the concept of transformative adaptation. Because then it's all about how we adapt. Do we adapt in the way which adaptation has mostly been talked about so far, which means trying to perpetuate the existing system? It means doing things like, if you're facing with ever-increasing instances of flooding, as we are, and in this country, and worse still, of course, in many other parts of the world, much agricultural land in China right now is underwater. Karachi is mostly underwater right now as we speak. Do you deal with that situation by simply trying to build higher seawalls, more hard flood defences, etc.? That's not going to work. They're going to be overwhelmed. They're going to break sooner or later. Or do you have some more creative, strategic, systemic way of thinking about adaptation? And that's what is implicit in the concept of transformative adaptation, which has been around for some time, but in my hands and the hands of those I'm collaborating with in my work on this, which includes my colleagues in Greenhouse, in the Facing Up to Climate Reality project, and includes colleagues in Extinction Rebellion. The concept of transformative adaptation says, let's adapt in a much more intelligent, creative, forward-looking way. Let's adapt in a way that simultaneously mitigates, that simultaneously reduces carbon emissions, whereas building seawalls and so on, of course, just increases them. Let's adapt in a way that attempts to work with nature rather than against nature and accepts some of the tides of what's coming. So an example, a very important example would be, if we're thinking about flood defences, it would be natural flood defences rather than artificial ones. So rebuilding, restoring wetlands, restoring mangrove swamps, things like that. And that transformative adaptation tries to transform our society into the direction which it needs to transform in any way in terms of making it a better place. So more local, higher quality food, more interaction between people, less insecurity. The agenda of energy descent, the agenda of relocalization, the kind of agenda which many of us are familiar with from local futures, from the transition towns movement, from permaculture. All of this is incorporated in the idea of transformative adaptation. The difference is that what we're attempting to add in is the idea that to get this done, we may have to use the tools, we may have to use the methods that we've become accustomed to through things like Extinction Rebellion. Yeah? In other words, if governments and local authorities will not enable transformative adaptation to occur, well then we'll do it anyway. And where necessary, we'll step outside the law to do it. That's the essence of the idea. You could think of it as sort of transition towns meets Extinction Rebellion. And that's part of what I have in mind and I hope for, that we'll get a kind of alliance, a kind of convergence, a real movement of movements in the years to come, of people who recognize that the system has to change, that we're prepared to take it into our own hands to do that. And if that means stepping outside the law, if that means building and defending eco-villages, if that means creating pop-up allotments and being serious about growing the food on them and seeing that to fruition and gaining more food security and so forth, well then that's what we'll do. And that's basically the idea. That's the idea of transformative adaptation. I'm absolutely convinced that it's an idea whose time has come. And I'm seeing quite a lot of nods, which is always an encouraging thing for a speaker to see when they're giving a talk like this. A word on the relation of transformative adaptation to deep adaptation. Some of you will be familiar with the concept of deep adaptation, introduced by my friend and colleague Jem Bendell. So I'm editing a book with Jem at the moment on deep adaptation. Our perspectives are somewhat different. Because deep adaptation, as it's presented in his famous paper of that name, is the version of adaptation which says, let's assume that societal collapse is inevitable. And there's an important difference between myself and Jem, which is that I don't believe it's inevitable. I just believe it's overwhelmingly probable. Right? I believe it's now getting to the stage where it takes almost something like a miracle to see how we're going to stop it. But I still think we should try to create that miracle if we possibly can, or if we can't create it, at least create the conditions of possibility for it, hold out hope for it. But the concept of deep adaptation, the idea of adapting in ways which will mean that if collapse comes, it's less hard for us. So ideas like, for example, relocating important infrastructure away from the sea, taking care of nuclear installations and chemical installations so that they are not going to poison us all if collapse comes. The idea of deep adaptation is absolutely well-founded. You don't have to believe that collapse is inevitable to believe that deep adaptation should be undertaken. So I strongly believe that we should do deep adaptation. And in fact, transformative and deep adaptation end up being almost the same thing, so long as you don't assume that collapse is inevitable. Provided one doesn't assume that collapse is certain and keeps aiming at transformation, they're virtually the same thing, given that energy descent and relocalization, etc., those things that we need to prepare for collapse, are also the best strategy for preventing collapse. Yeah? So if we do transformative adaptation and everything turns out well and we get very lucky, then we get to prevent collapse in the best possible way. So transformative adaptation, including deep adaptation, is very likely our best bet to help create a miracle. And also notice this, if we act as if the prospect of collapse is real, and as if relocalization and energy descent are inevitable, then we also wake up others best, because they see us practicing what we preach. They see us as acting as if it's real, and then they start to be able to believe that it is, which it is. This civilization is finished, as in my book of that name. The only question that remains open is whether it finishes by way of collapse or by way of deliberate transformation, or most likely some kind of combination of the two, and whether it's more of one or more than of the other is going to be an absolutely critical question for the years to come. So, transformative adaptation is an idea I'm claiming whose time has very much come. If you are interested in this idea, which we'll be discussing now this afternoon, I'm going to take questions and then we'll talk in small groups. If you're interested, then I'm going to pass around a little sign-up sheet where you can, if you wish, sign your email, and I'll send you the basic trad documents, and I'll also, if you want, send you my monthly email updates.